Right now, somewhere above you, there is a person in charge. A boss, a manager, a director, someone whose decisions shape your day, who can tell you what to do, and who quite possibly got where they are for reasons that have nothing to do with being good at it. You have almost certainly at some point looked at a person in authority and felt that small, hot flicker of resentment. Why is this person in charge of me? And underneath it sits an assumption most people never examine, that this is simply how human beings are, that someone always ends up on top, that the ambitious dominate and the rest of us fall in line. That hierarchy is human nature. For the overwhelming majority of human history, that assumption would have been not just wrong, but offensive. Because our ancestors did not choose leaders the way you think they did. In fact, for hundreds of thousands of years, they built their entire social world around a single, fierce, deliberate goal, making sure that no one could ever become their ruler. Let's start by killing the image in your head, because it is almost perfectly backwards. The cartoon version of the caveman leader is the biggest, strongest, most aggressive brute. The one who clubs his rivals, dominates by force, drags others around by sheer physical power. The alpha male. It is one of the most persistent myths about our deep past, and the anthropological reality is close to its exact opposite. In the small, mobile hunter-gatherer bands that humans lived in for most of our existence, the aggressive strongman was not the leader. He was the problem, and the group had a whole arsenal of tools for dealing with him. The anthropologist Christopher Boehm spent his career studying this, surveying dozens of foraging societies around the world, and he arrived at an idea that overturns everything the cartoon assumes. He called it the reverse dominance hierarchy. His crucial insight was that egalitarianism, a society of equals with no ruler, is not the same thing as the absence of hierarchy. It is a hierarchy. It is simply flipped upside down. In a normal dominance hierarchy, one powerful individual sits at the top and everyone else is spread out below. In a reverse dominance hierarchy, the entire rank-and-file bands together at the top, and the person they collectively dominate is any individual who tries to rise above the rest. The many deliberately and consciously keep down the one. As Boehm put it, the group must actively dominate its potential master if it wishes to remain equal. And this was not some peaceful accident of gentle people. It was a political system, consciously maintained, with real teeth. Boehm's evidence points to a strange U-shaped curve running through human history. Our distant ape ancestors, like chimpanzees, almost certainly lived under strict dominance hierarchies ruled by aggressive alpha males. Then, at some point, early humans flipped it, and for the vast span of the hunter-gatherer era, we were militantly, intentionally egalitarian. And then, only about 10 to 12,000 years ago, with farming, hierarchy came roaring back and grew into kings and empires and bosses. We are living in the second upswing of that curve. But the long, flat bottom of it, the egalitarian stretch, is where humans spent almost all of their time. So if there was no strongman ruling, what did leadership actually look like? It existed, but in a form so different from ours that it barely deserves the same word. The leader of a band, often called a headman, had essentially no power to command. He could not give an order and expect obedience. He could not punish. He could not force anyone to do anything. He led entirely through influence, and that influence had to be earned continuously through the exact opposite of the qualities we associate with power. Boehm found that across these societies, the desirable traits in a leader were consistently described in terms of what a leader must not be. Not overbearing, not boastful, not arrogant, not aloof. A good leader was generous to the point of keeping almost nothing for himself, calm when others panicked, wise in judgment, skilled at persuading rather than commanding, and above all, humble. Praise itself was handed out in tiny, careful doses because the group understood that admiration could go to a person's head, and a swelled head was the first symptom of the disease they most feared, a man who thought he was better than everyone else. Leadership was not a prize you won and kept. It was a temporary, revocable role that evaporated the instant you tried to convert it into authority. And when someone did try, when a person started to get arrogant, to accumulate, to act like a chief, The group had a graduated set of responses, and the first one was surgical, precise, and brutal in its own quiet way. It was ridicule. There is a famous story that captures this better than any theory. In the 1960s, the anthropologist Richard Lee was living among the Juntoisi of the Kalahari, and as a Christmas gift he decided to buy the group the largest, fattest ox he could find, imagining he'd be thanked as a generous benefactor. Instead, for days, everyone mocked his choice mercilessly. The ox was a bag of bones, they told him. It was thin, old, worthless. It would barely feed anyone. The feast would be a disaster. Lee grew genuinely distressed until the ox was slaughtered and revealed a thick, rich layer of fat, exactly as he'd known it would. It had been, in a sense, a joke. But when Lee asked why they had insulted a perfectly good animal, one of the men explained something that was not a joke at all. When a young man kills a lot of meat, he said, he comes to think of himself as a chief or a big man, and he thinks of the rest of us as his inferiors. We can't accept this, so we always speak of his meat as worthless. This way, the man explained, we cool his heart and make him gentle. Read that again, because it is the whole political philosophy of the egalitarian world in 2 sentences. They were not being ungrateful, they were running a deliberate machine for deflating status, applied to anyone who might start to rise, including a visiting anthropologist. The insult was a tool, and its precise purpose was to keep pride from turning into power. The man even named the ultimate stake. Someday, he said, this young man's pride will make him kill somebody. Arrogance was not a personality flaw. It was understood as the seed of tyranny, and it was stamped out on sight. Ridicule was only the first rung, though. Boehm documented a whole escalating ladder of what he called leveling mechanisms. If mockery didn't work, there was public opinion turning against you, often organized in whispered conversations behind the upstart's back, so a consensus could form before he even knew he was in trouble. If that failed, there was open disobedience, people simply ignoring the would-be leader's wishes. Then ostracism, the group withdrawing cooperation, refusing to share, freezing the person out, which in a world where survival depended on the band was a devastating punishment. And at the far end of the ladder, for the man who would not be humbled by anything else, there was the final sanction: execution. Boehm records cases of it. Among the Baruya, a man who seized his neighbor's property and forced their wives into sex was, in the end, killed by his own community. This was not a mob losing control. It was the ultimate expression of the same system that produced the friendly insults over the Christmas ox. A community that had decided, collectively, that one person's drive to dominate had become a threat to everyone and had removed that threat permanently. Egalitarianism, Boehm stressed, was not the product of humans being naturally sweet and peaceful. It was enforced, sometimes violently, by people who were willing to do whatever it took to stay free of a ruler. Which brings us to the deepest and most unsettling point, the one that turns this whole story back onto you. Boehm's argument is not that humans are naturally egalitarian. It is subtler and stranger than that. He believed that we carry both drives inside us. The ancient primate urge to dominate, inherited from our alpha male ancestors, and a countervailing urge to resist being dominated. Every human band was a battleground between those 2 impulses, and for 300,000 years, the second impulse won. The collective desire to not be ruled was strong enough, organized enough, and ruthless enough to suppress the individual desire to rule. That resistance instinct did not disappear. You are carrying it right now. That flicker of resentment you feel toward the boss who didn't earn it, toward the arrogant person in power, toward being ordered around by someone no better than you, that is not a modern workplace complaint. It is one of the oldest political instincts our species possesses, the same reflex that made your ancestors mock the boastful hunter and, when necessary, kill the tyrant. You are an egalitarian animal, shaped by hundreds of thousands of years in which the worst possible outcome was letting one person get above the rest. So what changed? Why do you live under a boss instead of within a band of equals? The answer is the same hinge that appears again and again in the human story: agriculture. Around 10 to 12,000 years ago, humans began to farm, and farming allowed something the foraging world never had: stored surplus, grain in a silo. wealth that could be accumulated, hoarded, and controlled. And you cannot mock a man into humility when he controls the granary that feeds you through winter. You cannot ostracize him when he owns the land you depend on. The leveling machinery that had worked for hundreds of thousands of years suddenly had nothing to grip. The upstart could now insulate himself from the group's disapproval with material power. And once one man managed to hold on to dominance and pass it to his son, the reverse dominance hierarchy flipped right side up again and stayed there. Chiefs became kings, kings became emperors, and the descendants of the most egalitarian creatures the planet had ever produced found themselves, for the first time, with masters. So here is the truth that inverts the entire question. Cavemen did not choose their leader. That was the whole point. For most of human history, our ancestors ran a relentless, sophisticated, sometimes lethal political project aimed at making sure no one could be chosen, that no single person would ever hold power over the group. The society without rulers was not a primitive stage we hadn't yet grown out of. It was an achievement, defended every single day by people who understood something we have half forgotten, that the desire to dominate is always there, in someone, waiting, and that freedom is the thing you have to actively protect it from. We assume being ruled is the natural human condition. It is a 10,000-year-old exception to a 300,000-year-old rule. And that hot flicker of resentment you feel toward the person who got to be in charge, the oldest, most stubborn, most human part of you, is the last ember of a fire our ancestors kept burning for a very long time. They just lived in a world that still let them put it to use.